She was my best friend for 20 years. Then she burned my life down. She had no idea I'd been watching the whole time. There's a particular quality to the light in Philadelphia in early November. It arrives low and sideways, pale as old paper, with the exhausted gold of something that has traveled a very long distance and is no longer sure it was worth the journey. I was sitting at my desk with that light crossing the floor when the email arrived. 7:43 in the morning. No subject line. The sender address was a string of random characters, the kind generated for a single purpose and then abandoned, a ghost address carrying one piece of cargo and nothing else. I almost deleted it. I moved my cursor to delete and held it there for 5 seconds. And then something, the same instinct that has always preceded my conscious thought, the one that says, "Pay attention, this is the moment," made me open it instead. Inside was a screenshot, one screenshot, a text message conversation between two people I knew better than almost anyone in my life. One was my husband, the other was my best friend. I read it once. I set my coffee cup down. I read it again, and then I laughed. Not because any part of it was funny, but because there is a specific quality of understanding that arrives sometimes as laughter. The laughter of someone who has been looking at a picture for 20 years and has just seen that it is two pictures at once and cannot understand how they ever saw only one. 20 years. I thought, so that is what it was. My name is Mara. I am 41 years old. I am a writer. And for 20 of those 41 years, I believed in someone who was, with great patience and considerable skill, building a life on top of mine. This is that story. Before I tell you about Jess, I need to tell you about me. Not the version on book jackets, the actual version. I am the kind of person who notices things. The way a voice changes when it is performing versus when it is simply speaking. The way a room shifts when a particular person enters it. The way a story that has been adjusted for consumption has a specific flatness in the places where the truth has been replaced with something more convenient. I notice these things, and I write them in the navy notebook I carry everywhere. I have 43 of them in a box in my closet. On the first page of each one, I write the same 2 words: pay attention. I have been paying attention my whole life. The tragedy is that I was paying attention to everything except the thing that most needed attending to. I was the person in the corner at the party, watching. I was never the person the room watched. I was never, and have never wanted to be, the gravitational center of any space I occupied. But I had also, I realize now, never known what it felt like to be noticed by someone who noticed things. Jess made me feel noticed. That is the precise, accurate description of what she did. And I did not understand for 20 years what it actually meant. I was 21 years old, in the campus bookstore at Penn, buying a novel I had already read twice because my original copy had finally fallen apart. She was standing at the same shelf. She looked at the book in my hand and said, without preamble, without any of the social scaffolding that most people construct before speaking to a stranger, "That book changed my life." She was wearing a yellow dress. It was October. Nobody wore yellow dresses in October in Philadelphia. Not in the way she was wearing it, as if the weather simply hadn't informed her of its preferences, and she had decided not to consult it. She was beautiful in the way that some people are beautiful, not only in their features, but in the specific quality of their aliveness, the brightness they bring to the air around them. "Me too," I said. We talked for 2 hours in the bookstore, then moved to the coffee shop across the street, without either of us suggesting it, simply migrating together the way people do when they're not ready to stop. She was quick and funny and generous with her attention in a way I had not encountered before. She made you feel, when she was talking to you, like you were the most interesting person she had met in a long time. I was dazzled. That is the honest word for it. Not just by her, by the version of myself that existed in her presence. With Jess, I was funnier, more spontaneous, less likely to stay at the edges of things. I was 21 years old, and I had just met the most vivid person I had ever encountered, and she wanted to be my friend. You don't question that at 21. You say yes. I said yes. I would spend the next 2 decades understanding what I had agreed to. 20 years is long enough to be altered by a person, long enough that they become part of the furniture of your interior life, present not just in the memories of specific events, but in the texture of how you think and what you expect from the world. Long enough to believe, completely and without reservation, that you know someone, and long enough to be profoundly wrong about that in ways you cannot imagine until the evidence is in front of you. Jess and I moved to Philadelphia together after graduation. Her idea. We found an apartment in West Philadelphia, 3rd floor, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that operated on the assumption that 2 people cooking simultaneously was theoretical rather than practical. In that apartment, I wrote my first novel. 3.5 years. Jess was the first reader of every draft. She celebrated every rejection letter with me. And there were 31, with the specific, generous energy of someone who understood that rejection is just weather. She was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, eating leftover Thai food from a container she was holding directly in her hand, when my phone rang with the call from the publisher. I watched her understand, from the changing quality of my expression, what was happening before I had said a word. When I hung up, she reached across and grabbed both my hands. "I knew," she said. "I always knew." I have thought about that sentence many times since. At 24, I heard it as love. Later, I would understand it differently. But I need you to know that the love was real, in the beginning, in its way. The friendship was genuine enough that its betrayal cost something. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the most painful part. I am a person who notices things. I need to say that again, because the question you will want to ask at some point in this story is, how did you not see it? You, who notice everything. How did 20 years go by? The answer is not that I wasn't paying attention. I was paying attention. The answer is that I had decided, before I started, what the noticing was allowed to find. She loves me, and therefore all of this, all these small observations, can be explained as something other than what they appear to be. I noticed that Jess asked about my contracts with a frequency that went beyond friendly interest, about advance structures and option clauses and reversion rights. I told her everything, because she was my best friend. I noticed the way she positioned herself at the junction between me and the rooms I most needed to enter. Not visibly, structurally. She knew people. She always knew people. And the way she connected me to those people had the effect, which I did not analyze until much later, of making her the door. I noticed the way she introduced me at events, always warmly, always lovingly, always in terms that were accurate enough to be unchallengeable and small enough to be limiting. "Mara writes these wonderful, intricate literary novels," she would say. "They're really for a specific kind of reader." I wrote "specific kind of reader" in my notebook once. I filed it under quirks, under "she doesn't mean it like that." I had 20 years of alternative explanations for everything Jess did. It took one email to take them all away. My second novel took 3 years to write and was, I still believe, the best thing I had ever done. The book reached further than I had reached before. It drew on things I understood about the specific loneliness of someone who observes so thoroughly she forgets to participate. It drew on the feeling of being in rooms full of people who are looking in every direction except toward you. Jess was the first person I showed the finished manuscript to. Of course she was. She had been the first reader of everything for 15 years. She called me Sunday evening after a weekend with the pages. "Mara," she said. Her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. I identified it at the time as awe. I understand now it was something else. Something more like a door opening onto a room she had been waiting to see inside for a long time. "This is the best thing you have ever written," she said. And then, "You have to let me show this to someone." I said I had an editor I trusted. She said she understood. The manuscript went to Theodore Marsh, who had worked with me since the first book and whose judgment I trusted more than almost anyone's. The book published the following spring. Jess sent white peonies on publication day, my favorite flower. She had always known they were my favorite. The card said, "The best is yet to come." I kept that card for 2 years. I threw it away the week after the email. Not in anger, with a specific sadness for which I have never found a better word. The sadness of understanding that a gesture of love was also, simultaneously, a calculation. That you can mourn a love and a theft at the same time, and that the mourning does not distinguish between them. I have never liked parties for my own books. This is not a pose, it is the genuine preference of someone who has spent her whole life in the observational role and finds the experience of being the observed genuinely uncomfortable. Like being asked to stand still in a room full of mirrors. But my publicist said it would be good for the book. Dominic said it would be fun, and Jess said she would stand beside me the whole time. That last reason was the most persuasive. The party was on a Thursday in May at a small gallery in Rittenhouse Square. Jess wore red. Of course she wore red. At some point in the middle of the evening, I watched her from across the room. She was at the center of a group I didn't know, 5 or 6 people arranged in the specific posture of an audience. I watched a woman in the group glance over at me, briefly, with an expression I couldn't read. Then she looked back at Jess. Later, standing near the drinks table, I heard 2 people, 3 feet from where I was standing, not knowing I was there, say, "I didn't realize her books were so," a pause, "niche." I went home and told Dominic the party had been wonderful. He said he was glad. I lay awake until 3 in the morning, thinking about the word niche and who might have placed it in that particular person's mouth. I filed it. I moved on. That was what I always did. For 20 years, that was always what I did. Dominic came into my life at a dinner party Jess organized 8 years ago. She had been trying to introduce us for months. "He's exactly your kind of person," she kept saying. I was resistant. I was 33 and in the middle of the second novel, and resistant to most things that were not writing. But I went to the dinner. He was at the far end of the table, talking about the ethics of adaptive reuse in historic architecture, and I thought, Jess was right. He had the quality I have always found most attractive in people, genuine interest. He was not performing curiosity. He was actually curious. We were married 2 years later. Jess gave the toast. It was beautiful. She talked about watching me become more fully myself over the years she had known me. Half the room cried. I cried. She hugged me at the edge of the garden afterward and said, "You deserve everything." I believed her completely. That is the thing I want you to hold as this story continues. Not that I was foolish, but that the performance was good enough to deserve belief. And some performances are so sustained, so consistent, so structurally sound, that they are indistinguishable from the real thing. Until they aren't. There's a kind of knowledge that arrives before comprehension. Before the brain has processed the information, something older and less verbal has already understood. You feel it as a change in temperature, as a sudden stillness, as the sensation of something settling into place that has been working toward this position for a very long time. I felt all of those things in the 3 seconds between opening the email and beginning to read. The sender address was a string of random characters. There was no text in the body, only the screenshot. Only the image dropped into the white space like a stone into still water. I read it once. I put my coffee cup down. I read it again. And then I laughed. Not from amusement, from the helpless recognition of something that has been true for a long time and has only just become impossible to look away from. I closed my laptop. I sat in the November light, and I thought, how long? How long has this been here? And what else is there? And what do I do now? Those 3 questions would take 3 months to answer. What I found was larger and more deliberate than I had imagined, but I am getting ahead of myself. The conversation in the first screenshot was dated 14 months before the email arrived. 14 months. Not recent, not a slip. This was a conversation that had been going on for over a year. It began with Jess expressing concern about me. She told Dominic I had been different lately. She said I was pulling away from everyone. She used the word fragile. She used it twice in 2 separate sentences, the way you use a word when you want it to land. I want to be precise. I was not fragile. I was 40 years old and working well and deeply engaged in the 3rd novel. I was not fragile. But she said fragile to my husband with the authority of someone who had known me for 20 years. Dominic responded, "She's been distant. I've noticed it too." And then, after her next message, "Has she said anything to you about Theo?" Dominic, "What do you mean?" Jess, "Nothing. Forget I said it. I've noticed she talks about him a lot. It's probably nothing." It's probably nothing. I have thought about those 3 words more than any other 3 words in this story. They are a masterpiece of a particular kind of manipulation. They plant the seed and simultaneously deny having planted it. They introduce an idea and retract it in a way that ensures it cannot be retracted. Because you cannot unhear, it's probably nothing. Once you have heard it, the nothing is already something. The probably is already a qualifier. The seed is already in the ground. I read that exchange and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, what it was designed to do. Not to manufacture evidence, just to introduce a particular quality of uncertainty into the space between a husband and his wife. To give the distance I had been keeping while I worked, the ordinary, necessary distance of someone deep in a difficult book, a different name. I read the rest of the screenshots that same day. When I finished, I went for a walk in the cold November air. I walked for 2 hours without destination. I thought about what it means to be known by someone and how thoroughly different that is from what Jess and I had been. I did not confront anyone. I want to explain why, because I know it is the first question. The answer is this: confrontation closes information. The moment you reveal what you know, the person you are confronting begins managing what you know. They explain, they contextualize, they minimize and reframe. They become the editor of the evidence. I did not want edited evidence. I wanted the whole structure. So I began to look. I read 3 years of email correspondence with Jess, not looking for what was being said, looking for the structure underneath, for the architecture of it. What I found was pattern. The questions about my contracts, asked casually across 3 years, assembled into sequence, had a different quality than they had individually. Individually, friendly curiosity. Assembled, a dossier. The systematic information gathering of someone building something who needed to understand the materials available to them. I then went through my phone, every text exchange with Jess going back 3 years. I read them looking for absence as much as presence. And what I found, conspicuously absent, was this. Jess had never, not once in 18 months, asked to read the 3rd novel. Not a page, not a chapter, not an inquiry about when she might see something. For 2 previous novels, she had been the first reader. She had asked regularly and enthusiastically for pages. For the 3rd novel, she had asked only, "How's the book going?" Never, "What is it about?" Never, "Can I read something?" I sat with that absence for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called my mother. My mother's name is Ruth, and she is 68 years old, and she has, in my experience, been right about things with a frequency that would be annoying if it were not so consistently useful. I told her about the email, the screenshots, what Jess had said to Dominic about Theo, the pattern in the emails, the 18 months of silence about the 3rd novel. I told her all of it. There was a long silence. Then she said, "I know." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "That's terrible." "I know." "What do you mean you know?" I said. "I mean I'm not surprised," she said. "I've been waiting for something like this for a long time." She told me about the first time she met Jess, Thanksgiving of our senior year. She told me about a phone conversation she had overheard, not deliberately, because the house was small and the walls were thin. Jess had been on the phone with someone. My mother had heard one side. She had heard Jess describe me, not unkindly, but in the language of assessment rather than affection. She had used the word potential. She had used the phrase interesting project. My mother had stood in the kitchen with this information for the rest of that holiday weekend. She had tried once, gently and indirectly, to say something. I had not heard it, or I had heard it and reached for the alternative explanation. She loves me. Why didn't you tell me more directly, I said. Because you wouldn't have believed me, she said, and because you loved her. So I waited, she said, until you could hear it. What do I do? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. You do what you have always done, she said. You pay attention, and then you write it down. I held the phone after she said that. There was nothing to say. She was right. She had always been right. And I was, finally, ready to hear it. 3 weeks after the email, I was going through files on my old laptop. Not looking for anything specific, just looking. The way you look at everything when you have decided to stop taking things at face value. I found it in the Correspondence Archive folder, a document named with the working title of my second novel, the internal title I had used throughout drafting and changed only in the final months before publication. I opened the file. It was my manuscript, not the published novel, the draft I had given Jess to read. The document metadata told me it had been opened 4 times. The first opening was when I sent it to her. The 4th opening had occurred on an external device. Someone had connected a drive. Someone had copied the file. I searched Jess's name on a literary database. 4 searches. On the 4th, I found a manuscript submission to a publisher I had never worked with. Author Jessica Caldwell. Submitted 16 months ago. Declined 6 months later. I requested the available excerpt through a contact at the database. It arrived the following morning. I read the first page. I recognized it. Not exactly. She had changed names, changed settings, changed enough of the surface that it was not the same book. But the architecture was mine. The specific logic of the central relationship, the way it was constructed, the sequence of revelations, the voice of the narrator was mine. She had taken the thing I spent 3 years building from the deepest available part of myself and reassembled it into something she could put her name on. And the publisher had declined it, not because they found the theft, because Jess was not a good enough writer to make the architecture hold without the voice that built it. You cannot steal the bones of a thing and expect them to stand without the muscle. I closed my laptop. I walked to the window, and I thought about the night I got the call about my first novel. Jess's hands around mine at the kitchen table. I always knew. I understood now what she had always known, and I knew what I had to do. Once you see the pattern, you cannot stop seeing it. The past becomes a different country, the same roads, the same landmarks, but the names have changed. I spent 2 weeks mapping everything, not in the frantic way of someone responding with adrenaline, methodically, the way I approach a manuscript. Structure first. What I found was this: the manuscript was not the beginning. It was the most visible element of something that had been operating below the surface of our friendship for at least 3 years. She had taken ideas, not the large ones, not the central conceits, not the plots, the small ones, the half-formed thoughts I shared in the unguarded way you share early ideas with someone you trust completely. These are the most vulnerable things a writer has, not the finished work, the unfinished thought, the thing in its becoming. She had taken those early thoughts and used them in pitches to editors I had been developing relationships with. Not the same ideas, adjacent. Close enough that when my fully developed work reached those editors, it arrived already familiar, already slightly late, already the second version of something they had subconsciously encountered. She had also introduced herself at events I had not attended as my literary collaborator. Not friend, collaborator, with the implication that what I produced was a joint enterprise. The theft was not committed from a distance. It was a crime of proximity, a crime that required exactly the level of access that a 20-year friendship provides. I thought about the clock I had taken apart when I was 6 years old. I thought about memorizing every piece, about putting them all back in the right order, about leaving it exactly as I found it so no one would know I had been inside. We had not been talking. Not in the sense of not speaking. We spoke every day about the practical things. But we had not been talking. Not about the distance that had settled into our house like a weather system that had arrived and didn't know how to leave. I asked him to talk. A Thursday evening. I made dinner with the specific intentionality of someone creating conditions for a difficult conversation. We sat down. I said, "There's a conversation we haven't been having." He looked at me. He nodded. He told me. He told me about conversations with Jess across 2 years. The text messages, the phone calls, the coffees, the slow, patient construction of a narrative. The narrative of a wife who was struggling, a wife who was, perhaps, directing her energy toward her editor in ways that were going to cost their marriage if someone didn't say something. He had not believed it entirely. That is important. He had not become convinced, but he had allowed it to settle, allowed it to become one of the possible explanations for the distance, for the quiet, for the hours at my desk that I had never had to justify before. He had been doing the labor of refusal for 2 years, constructing the counter-narrative, the reassurance. But the labor of refusal is exhausting, and it leaves traces. It leaves exactly the kind of trace I had been feeling without knowing its source. "Did anything ever," he began. "No," I said, the word before he finished the sentence. Not from defensiveness, from clarity. Nothing, in any form. None of it was real. He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded, and we began the conversation we had not been having. By the end of it, our shoulders were touching, and the piano that had needed tuning for 2 years had been played back into itself. He told me everything Jess had said, the full architecture, conversation by conversation over 2 years. She had begun with concern, always with concern, wrapped in the warmth of a friend who cares about both parties. She had said, "She's been different." She had said, "She's pulling away from everyone." She had said, "I'm worried about her." Each of these things was true. I had been different. I had been pulling away. She was worried about me, not in the way she presented it, not for the reasons she cited, but in her own way. She was worried about herself. And then she had started dropping Tio, never accusatorially, in the specific, gentle way of someone who is not accusing anyone of anything, who is only sharing something she has noticed, who would hate for it to create problems. She said she had seen us together at a reading, said something in the dynamic had seemed different to her, said probably nothing, said, "Forget I said it." He told me about one conversation in particular, a coffee 8 months before the email. She had said, "I don't want to tell you this, but I think you deserve to know." She had said she came home different one night. I knew the night. I had been at a manuscript meeting with Theo that ran 3 hours because we had cracked a structural problem, and I drove home fast with the solution burning in my head, still inhabiting the world of the book. I came home different. I was full of the novel. Jess saw that fullness. She named it something else. She gave it to my husband, and he had been carrying it for 8 months. I felt for the first time since the email something less like anger and more like grief. Not for me, for him. For 2 years of distance manufactured and installed in our house by someone who had sat at our table and known where we kept the spare key. "I'm sorry you had to carry that," I said. "It's over now," he said. "Yes," I said. "It's over now." Theodore Marsh has been my editor for 12 years. He is 61 years old, British by birth, and dry in the way that certain very intelligent people are dry. Not as a performance, but as a natural condition. He is the most precise reader I have ever encountered. He is also, this needs to be stated clearly, entirely and completely my friend, my colleague, nothing else, never anything else, in any form. I am saying this not because it needs defending, but because Jess tried to make it need defending, and I refuse to let that stand. I called him the day after my conversation with Dominic. He picked up immediately. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. "What do you know?" I said. "Quite a lot," he said, "for quite some time." He had known about the manuscript submission for 9 months, found out through a contact at the publisher who had recognized structural similarities when encountering my work in another context. The information had reached him. He had kept records. He had waited. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said. "Because the way you find out about something like this matters," he said. "If I had told you, you would have received it from outside, as information I was delivering." He paused. "That is not how something like this should be received. It should be found, by you, in the way you find things." He had a folder, organized and updated. Original submission, email chain, metadata evidence, cross-referenced with dates and contexts. The specific documentation of someone who had been keeping things for someone else until they were ready. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to write," I said. A silence. "Good," he said. One word, in the specific tone Theo uses when he means more than he is saying, which is almost always. There is a particular skill in the construction of a sustained deception. It is not the skill of lying. Lying is easy. The skill is in the architecture, in building something load-bearing at every point. That distributes the weight evenly so no single element is asked to hold too much. That has enough truth in it at every level that the foundation never feels unstable. That can be walked through every day by the person it was built around and feel to them like the ordinary landscape of their life. I spent a week mapping it, structurally, the way I approach every manuscript. What I found were 3 parallel tracks. The first track was professional. The manuscript theft was the visible element, but not the foundation. The foundation was the years of careful management of how I was perceived, the introductions that were limiting without being challengeable, the language that positioned my work as admirable but inaccessible, the ideas taken early and planted elsewhere, designed to create a ceiling, not to prevent my success, to keep it managed. The second track was social. Jess had positioned herself as the intermediary between me and the wider world, the person without whom certain rooms were unavailable. What she was actually doing was controlling the door, deciding what came through it, keeping what she wanted, redirecting what she wanted, for years, while I thanked her. The third track was personal, the campaign against my marriage, the most precisely engineered element, not designed to destroy, that would have been too visible, designed to destabilize, to install just enough uncertainty in the space between a husband and his wife, to ensure I was never entirely certain of the ground I was standing on. I looked at the whole structure when I had finished mapping it, and I felt, I want to be honest about this, a dark and entirely involuntary recognition. Not admiration, recognition. The discipline required to build and maintain all of this across years, the patience of it, the sustained attention in the dark. I recognized that discipline because I shared it. She had applied it to something I could not admire, but I understood it, and understanding it was what I needed to do what came next. We had dinner every month. First Thursday, a restaurant in Center City neither of us had chosen specifically, but both of us had continued attending, the way people continue things that have become ritual, not because they require it, but because the ritual has become ballast. The dinner fell 8 days after my conversation with Theo. I went. I know that surprises people. I know the conventional response would be withdrawal. But I had not finished yet. And there was something else, something less rational. I needed to see her, after everything, one more time, with clear eyes. I arrived first. I watched her cross the room. She moved the way she always moved, as if the restaurant had been waiting for her specifically. She saw me and smiled, warm, immediate, genuine-looking, the product of 20 years of practice. She sat down. She ordered wine. She asked how the book was going. I said it was going well. And I watched her. Not for the lie, not for the crack in the surface, for the quality of attention she was paying me, the temperature of it. And I saw it. For the first time in 20 years, clearly. She was paying attention to me the way you pay attention to something you are managing. The warmth was real in its way, but it was the warmth of an investor watching a portfolio, the attention of someone tracking the performance of an asset. I had spent 20 years receiving this as love. Sitting across from her in that restaurant, watching her talk about a prize she had no connection to, I understood finally what the attention actually was. When the dinner ended, she hugged me at the door. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," I said. I walked to my car. I sat in it for 5 minutes. And I said goodbye to 20 years the way you say goodbye to something that deserved better than what it was. Quietly, without ceremony, in the dark of a parking garage in December. Then I drove home, and I went to my desk, and I began. Caroline Davis has been in my life since the 3rd year of knowing Jess. Warm, reliably late, possessed of a gift for making difficult social situations feel manageable. I called her on a Sunday afternoon, 10 days after the dinner. I told her the outline. She was quiet when I finished. Not the silence of shock, the silence of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is deciding whether the moment has finally come to put it down. "I have to tell you something," she said. For 4 years, Jess had been managing how I was perceived in our shared social and professional world, not destroying my reputation, curating it. In every room she entered with my name, she had been the primary narrator of who Mara Ellison was, and she had told the story in a register just small enough to fit under the space I actually occupied, just contained enough that I could not quite reach my own ceiling. Caroline had seen it. She had been certain for 2 years. She had said nothing. "Why?" I said. "Because you loved her," she said. "And I knew that telling you before you were ready would only make you defend her." "You were right," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry I couldn't find a way sooner." "You waited until I was ready," I said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I did." I cried after we hung up. Not in the dramatic way, in the shower, where I do most of my crying, because the shower is the one place where there is no evidence afterward. And then I dried off, and I went back to my desk, and I wrote. There is a moment in the writing of every novel when the structure becomes visible, when all the pieces resolve into coherence, not completion, the shape of the finished thing, clear for the first time. I had that moment on a Tuesday night in December, at my desk, with a glass of wine I had mostly forgotten, with Theo's folder and the emails and the timeline spread across my laptop. And it resolved, quietly, with the quality of something that has been in the process of becoming itself for a very long time and has simply, finally, arrived. I saw 20 years in a single image, the bookstore in October and the yellow dress. The specific quality of the attention she turned toward me, the warmth of it, the calculation underneath, the apartment and the drafts and the hands around mine at the kitchen table, the parties and the introductions and the niche and the specific kind of reader, the manuscript copied in the night, Dominic sitting with doubt he had not asked for, 2 years of the piano needing tuning, the whole structure. And I understood something looking at it clearly for the first time. Jess had never understood what she was trying to take. She understood its value. She understood that proximity to it was worth having. But she did not understand what it was made of. She did not understand that what she was trying to copy was not the architecture. It was the expression of a specific interior life. And you cannot copy an interior life. You can reproduce its surface. You can reassemble its bones, but the thing itself, the specific quality of how one person sees the world and finds language for it is not transferable. She had spent 20 years trying to do something that was impossible, and I had spent 20 years not knowing she was trying. I opened a new document. I typed the title. I began. I want to tell you how the decision was made. Not the decision to write the book. That was less a decision than a recognition. The decision about what kind of book it would be, whether to fictionalize heavily, whether to change enough to make it deniable. I walked with it for a week, through Rittenhouse Square in the mornings, along the river in the afternoons, through the streets in the evenings when the December light went blue and dark before 5. I thought about deniability, about what it protects you from, the confrontation, the risk, the discomfort of saying publicly, "This is what happened." But deniability is also a kind of dishonesty. And I am a writer, and the only thing I am ultimately obligated to is the truth. I thought about my mother. Write it down. Not fictionalize it carefully. Write it down. I thought about Teo's 9 months of keeping records, Caroline's 2 years of watching, Dominic's 2 years of carrying doubt, my own 20 years of filing things under alternative explanations. All that patience, all that restraint, all that waiting. And I thought, I am not going to protect her by making this a story that could be about anyone. It is not a story about anyone. It is a story about Jess, and it will be told honestly. I opened the document on a Thursday morning, at my desk in the November light, with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. I began. The third novel took 8 months. 8 months was exactly right, the time it needed to find the correct distance from what I was writing, close enough to make it true, far enough to make it art. I wrote it differently from the other 2 books. The first was architecturally deliberate, built from the foundation up. The second was excavated, found as much as built. The third was direct. Direct in the way of someone who has something specific to say and has finally understood how to say it. I wrote in chronological order. I almost never write in chronological order. But this story needed to be lived through, not structured around. I changed the names, most of them, not all of them. The character who was Jess is named Claire. The name means clear, transparent, visible for what it is. I gave her Jess's physical description, her vocal quality, her yellow dress, the apartment and the drafts and the hands. I changed nothing essential. I did not write it to wound. I want to say that clearly. I wrote it because it was the truest thing I had to say. Because the alternative, the carefully fictionalized version, the deniable version, would have been a betrayal of the only thing I have ever been completely committed to, the truth, all of it, as clearly as language can hold it. I wrote every morning, 6 to noon. I showed no one the pages, not Dominic, not Theo, not my mother. I wrote it alone, because the most important things are always written alone, in the quiet, in the light, with the words arriving one by one, patient as anything, waiting to become the truth of something. Dana Pierce's name had been in my peripheral vision for years. You cannot work in literary fiction in Philadelphia for a decade without knowing who she is. 54 years old, the most sought-after literary agent in the city for 15 years. Direct in a way that some people experience as blunt and others as a relief. I had never worked with her. I understood, after everything, why. Jess had been the reason. Not through anything as direct as intervention, through impression management. Dana had received a version of me, through the social channels literary networks run on, that was accurate enough to explain and limiting enough to close the door. Difficult to work with, resistant to commercial input, interesting critically, but unlikely to break through. I contacted Dana directly in February. Just an email, brief, direct. I said, I have been told, by someone whose information I now have reason to question, that you and I wouldn't be a good fit. I thought you should have the chance to decide that for yourself. She called me 3 days later. I stayed up until 2 in the morning reading your second novel, she said. I don't do that anymore. I waited. Who told you we wouldn't be a good fit, she asked. I told her. A pause. short. The pause of someone connecting a dot they had been holding for a while. "Of course it was," she said. "Can you come in on Thursday?" I went. We talked for 3 hours. I told her about the third novel, what it was doing, what kind of writer I was. When I finished, she said, "Send it to me when it's done, before anyone else." I said I would. I did. The book sold in a 2-day auction in October, to the publisher I had wanted for years, with an editor I had admired since her first list. In terms Dana negotiated with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this project and knew what it was worth. I am not going to give you the number. The number is not the point. The point is that the book sold on its own terms, without interference, without management, without anyone standing between the work and the room it needed to enter. For the first time. I sat at my desk on the morning the deal was confirmed and thought, so this is what it feels like. Not triumph, something more like the quiet pleasure of a thing being returned to its correct position. The way a piece of furniture looks right when it has finally been placed where it was always supposed to go. The film option came 4 months before publication. I told Dominic, I told Tio, I told Caroline and my mother. The book published on a Tuesday in October. Chapter 7 contains a scene in which the narrator, at a party for her second novel, watches her best friend work the room, watches the introductions, watches the frames they construct. The character's name in that scene is Claire. Her description is exact. Her yellow dress, her voice, her way of making you feel when she looked at you, like you were the most interesting thing she had encountered in a long time. I knew it was a choice. I made it anyway. Because some things need to be said clearly enough that no one can mistake what is being said. And I had spent 20 years being quiet about the wrong things. I was done being quiet. The call came on a Sunday morning, 4 days after publication. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone rang, her name on the screen. I had been expecting it, not dreading it, just expecting it the way you expect weather you have been watching develop. I answered. "Mara," she said. Her voice was the same, the specific warmth of it, the quality of her attention when she said your name. 20 years of that voice. I had loved that voice. I was aware, in the moment of hearing it again, of both the love and the loss of it simultaneously. "Jess," I said. A pause. "I read the book," she said. "I know," I said. Another pause. Longer. The silence of someone who had prepared several versions of this conversation and is discovering I am not cooperating with any of them. "Is Claire supposed to be me?" she said. "Claire is a character," I said, "who shares certain qualities with someone I have known for 20 years, who wears her dress and makes her introductions and takes the things she takes. This isn't fair," she said. Not, "I didn't do those things," not, "You have this wrong," not, "I'm sorry. This isn't fair." "What would fair look like to you?" I asked. She didn't answer. "Why didn't you say anything?" she said finally. "Earlier, before the book." And I thought, there it is. The question of someone who believed my silence was complicity, who had relied for 20 years on my willingness to look away. "Because I wasn't finished watching," I said, "and because the book needed to be written first." She was quiet. "Jess," I said, "I know about the manuscript. I know about what you told Dominic. I know about the 3 years of professional interference. I know all of it, and I have written it down." A long silence. The specific silence of architecture beginning to understand it has been seen. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "I just wanted you to know that I know." And I ended the call. I put the phone down. I poured my coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the October street, and I thought, it's done. Not finished, done. There is a difference. I put it down, and I went back to my desk, and I opened Chapter 3 of the next book, and I wrote. Things do not resolve the way they do in stories. I've been writing stories for 20 years, and I know this, and I am still surprised by how true it is when applied to my own life. There is no clean ending. There is only what happened, and then what happened next. Jess did not publicly respond to the book. She did not deny it. She did not issue a statement. She disappeared. Not dramatically, but from the rooms we had shared, the events, the circles, the social geography of my professional world, she began to be less present, then absent, then simply gone. The way someone is gone when going is easier than remaining in the atmosphere the truth has created. Tio told me, 6 months after publication, that the publisher Jess had submitted the stolen manuscript to had quietly removed her from their contact list. He told me without commentary. I received it without commentary. Some things settle themselves when the conditions change. As for Dominic, we went to counseling. Not because the marriage was broken, but because something had been inserted into it that didn't belong there, and we wanted to remove it cleanly. Understand what had been done. Understand what we needed from each other going forward. 8 months of hard work. The kind of hard that comes from saying things you have been not saying, from naming the distance you have been living with, and mapping where it came from. At the end of 8 months, we went to a restaurant we had never been to before. A new place, nothing with history. We ordered things we had never ordered. We talked for 3 hours about ordinary things, about the film, about a trip we were planning, about the October light. It was the best dinner we had had in years, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the piano had been tuned, and the music, when it came, was exactly what it was supposed to be. I am suspicious of the instructional impulse. The impulse to arrive at the end of a difficult experience and extract a portable lesson, something summarizable, something that can be handed to other people as advice. I have read too many such lessons and found them too clean, too stripped of the specific complexity that made the experience worth attending to. So I am not going to give you a lesson. I am going to tell you what I actually understand now that I did not understand before. I understand that trust and attention are different things. I was paying attention to Jess for 20 years. I was trusting her completely. Both of those things were simultaneously true. The attention was genuine, the trust was genuine. The mistake was in the prior decision I had made. So long ago it had become invisible, about what the noticing was allowed to find. She loves me, and therefore everything I notice will be interpreted through that decision. Familiarity doesn't blind you. It tells you what you're allowed to see. I also understand something about my work. Jess spent 20 years trying to take something from me. She wanted the position, the visibility, the rooms I was in. She wanted what the work produced. She did not understand what the work was. She did not understand that the work is not a product of professional standing. The work is a product of seeing the world in a specific way and finding language for what you see. That is not transferable. You cannot take it. You can copy its surface until it looks exactly right, and it will still be wrong. Because the thing that makes it what it is lives inside a single, specific person's way of being in the world. She spent 20 years trying to take something she could not have, not because I protected it, because she did not understand what it was. And the saddest part, the part that produces something closer to grief than anger, is that if she had simply been my friend, if she had simply loved me the way I loved her, she would have had everything she actually needed. Instead, she had a strategy, and at the end of the strategy, she had nothing. I called my mother the week the book hit the list. A Sunday morning in November, the pale gold Philadelphia light coming through the windows the way it always does. She picked up on the second ring. "Mara," she said. "Ruth," I said. We both laughed. I told her about the list. "Of course," she said. The specific, unhurried confidence of someone who has been certain of something for a long time and is mildly amused the world has finally noticed. "You were right about Jess," I said. "I know," she said. "You always were." "I know that too." "I should have trusted you sooner," I said. She was quiet. "No," she said finally. "You trusted me in the way you were capable of at the time." "That wasn't enough," I said. It was exactly enough, she said. You're here. You found it. You wrote it. You're on the phone talking about the list. I sat with that. It took 20 years, I said. Some things take 20 years, she said. That doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you were patient. We talked for another hour about the book and the film and Dominic and the trip we were planning, about her garden in Wilmington, about a novel she was reading that she thought I would like. When we hung up, I sat at my desk for a while. The new document was open, first page blank, the specific whiteness of a beginning. I put my fingers on the keys, and I started to write. I write every morning, 6 to noon, the most important rule of my professional life. Not about discipline, or rather, discipline is not the point. The point is that the morning is when I know what I think. It is the time before the world arrives with its requirements, before the day has made its demands, before the self-consciousness of performing a life has engaged. It is the time when I am simply most honestly present. My desk is the same desk. The window is the same window. The light is the same light, low in winter, high in summer, always with that quality of having traveled a long way to arrive here, in this room, on this morning. I am 41 years old. I have written 3 novels. I have lost a friendship that lasted 20 years. I have a husband in the kitchen making coffee with the deliberate attention of someone who believes that coffee made correctly is a small and reliable form of care. I have a mother in Wilmington who is right about most things and always has been. I have a notebook, navy blue, spiral bound, the 44th. On the first page, in the handwriting I have had since I was 19, 2 words: pay attention. I was wrong about a lot of things. I was wrong about Jess for 20 years. But I was right about this. Writing is how I understand things. Telling the truth, the specific, honest, undefended truth, is the most important thing I know how to do. Patience is not weakness. Watching is not passivity. The person in the corner with the notebook is not the lesser person in the room. She is the one who will still be here, still writing, still paying attention, long after the people who did not take her seriously have stopped being in the room. I am still here, and the words keep coming, one after another, in the light, in the quiet, patient as anything. Thank you for listening. If something in this story found you, if any part of it recognized itself in you, I hope it was useful. Not as instruction, just as company. The kind that says, I saw this too. I was paying attention too. And I am still here, still writing, still.